The honourable member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. There's something about this government that I struggle to understand. It's true that we all come from our own backgrounds and our own experiences. It's true that the families we were born into, the schools we attended, the institutions that we worked for or that shaped our lives have all influenced not just the lives that we've led, but the way that we view the world. It's inevitable, and it's fair enough. But what most people try to do, even if it's just occasionally, is step outside of their own world, step outside of their life experience and try just for a moment to put themselves in the shoes of other people who didn't lead the same lives, who don't lead the same lives. And that's what I struggle to understand about a lot of people, a lot of members of the current government. Because if they did take a moment to actually stop and really listen to the stories of the lives of people who weren't born into a family that could afford to send them to private school, of people who weren't born into a family who had multiple property investments from which they could live, who weren't born into a family where there were two parents at home, who weren't born into a family where there was any parent at home who had a job, who weren't born into a family who thought nothing of being able to pay $40,000 a year to send them to an elite school so that they could make the right connections and have the right friends to be able to ascend to positions of power. If members of the government actually genuinely listened to those people, then we wouldn't have to be standing in this parliament debating pieces of legislation like this. You know, perhaps they should come to my electorate and meet some of the hardest working people that you will ever come across, who are scraping from paycheck to paycheck, but even worse than that, are scraping from shift to shift, never knowing when their next shift is going to come, not knowing necessarily how much they're going to get paid for that shift because it's for a different employer or a different labour hire company, never knowing whether or not they're going to be able to pay the rent or put food on the table or buy a netball top or a pair of footy boots for their kids, and who are absolutely vulnerable to predatory financial institutions because they're so desperate for a bit of extra money just to get by. That's who the Treasurer should spend some time speaking to. And then maybe he would understand why it is that members on this side of the chamber, even those of us who have never had to go to a payday lender, even those of us who have been fortunate enough to always be able to tick all of the boxes to get a loan, no matter how stringent the rules are standing here to say this sort of legislation causes harm. And maybe we should step back for a moment and stop talking about the technicalities of what financial institutions can and can't do and about lending laws, and just focus for a moment on the health impacts of financial stress and living day to day in that precarious world. Now, we have in my electorate, in Frankston, just around the corner from my electorate office, in fact, one of the new mental health services that, to their credit, the current government has funded as a result of the increase in mental health stress during the pandemic. It's called a Head to Health site. and it involves both being able to attend at a clinic, and in this case it's the Young Street Medical Clinic, or to access mental health assistance online. The Australian Government's Head to Health website notes the following, and I quote, "Mental health and financial safety are strongly linked. Experiencing a mental illness can add to financial stresses, and financial stresses can add to a mental illness." As the Senate inquiry looking at this legislation heard from the organisations that represent every day people who are in financial stress because they're in underpaid and low-paid jobs, and because they've fallen prey to either predatory payday lenders or loans that they just can't and never were going to be able to repay. And those representatives of those hard-working, decent Australians told government and opposition members alike that should lending standards reduce as a result of the repeal of the RLOs, this is likely to create greater over-indebtedness. The impact of unaffordable debt on individuals, families and communities is immense. Community lawyers and financial counsellors speak to people every day who are struggling to pay their debts while trying to juggle other expenses like energy bills and groceries. Over-indebtedness can result in significant, longer-term impacts on individuals as it affects their capacity to provide for housing, health, education and retirement. The submission to the Senate inquiry went on to say that debt can have a harmful effect on relationships with family and friends, increase isolation and exacerbate mental health issues. Studies have found that people with unmet loan payments had suicidal ideation and suffered from depression more often than those without such financial problems. I'm sure there are members of this chamber who have, at periods of their life, had financial stress. And there may well be people in this chamber who have had financial stress caused by a loan that they couldn't service. And if there are, they should be calling on that experience and calling on their humanity to oppose this legislation. You know, it's just almost inexplicable that the government would choose to call this bill supporting economic recovery. Whose economic recovery is this legislation supposed to be supporting? The evidence to the Senate committee at the end of last year was that there was no lack of available credit. Whose economic recovery is being supported by going against the first recommendation of the Royal Commission into banks and the financial services sector? The first recommendation. You know, this government under this Prime Minister voted time and time and time again against establishing a Royal Commission into the banks and financial institutions. And we know that they got dragged kicking and screaming, this Prime Minister, to reluctantly announce such a Royal Commission. And then we heard over and over again words that sounded like commitment to the inquiry. And when the final report was tabled, we heard words from the Prime Minister and the Treasurer that sounded a lot like commitment to the recommendations of the inquiry. But we haven't seen the action. The Treasurer's own implementation schedule for the recommendations of the Royal Commission isn't worth, well, it's not written on paper because it's online, but you know, isn't worth the internet that it's written on. He hasn't come close to following it. And the real truth, not the words, the real truth of their commitment to making sure that Australians don't have their lives and their families and their physical and their mental health ruined by the actions of the big banks is in their walking away from the first recommendation of the Royal Commission. I almost can't work myself up to get angry because it's just sad and disappointing. And today has been a day of disappointment. Today has been a day where women's rage and distress and hope have been dashed by a Prime Minister and a government that know the words but don't have the actions, and weren't brave enough to go and listen, really listen, to Australian women calling for gender equality and real systemic response to endemic domestic violence and sexual assault in this country. Today is a day when the Prime Minister, on indulgence at the start of question time, gave a speech which one can only imagine he thought would justify his pronouncement from on high that he couldn't be seen to go out to address a rally of thousands and thousands of Australian voters, most of whom happen to be women, but 3 or 4 of them could come to his office and listen to what he had to say.
The member for Dunkley is now straying from the topic of the bill before the House, and whilst it may be an important matter, this is not the appropriate place for that discussion.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker, but I'm getting there. I'll get there because the Prime Minister wouldn't listen. And here we have legislation that is in exactly that vein, where you have financial services representatives, community legal centres, individuals taking the time and the effort to make submissions and give evidence to this government through a Senate committee about why this legislation should not go ahead, and it's almost as though the Prime Minister refused to go out and listen to them. It's almost as though the Prime Minister's attitude is, I'll tell you what you need, and what you need is what I've got to say. And it flows through this entire government, and it starts with where I started. If you are a government that believes that you rule the country, you don't govern the country, you don't lead the country, you believe that you rule the country because you believe your privilege has led you to a life that means that you cannot even comprehend the life that other people have to lead, then you don't listen and learn from other people and do what they need. You know, there is a difference between people who grew up being told they were the conquerors of the world and people who grew up understanding that they were going to need to conquer the world. And I'm here to be the voice for people who grew up knowing that they were going to have to work to conquer the world. And so are my Labor colleagues. And that's why we won't support this legislation, which makes it easier for those institutions that are the conquerors of the world to take advantage of people that are just working day by day to conquer the difficulties that are put before them. Deputy Speaker, I call your attention to the state of the House.
Say quorum required. Quorum required. Ring the bells.